We have a very special guest with us here today, and he was on the podcast before. Welcome back, James. And for those of you who don't know about James, he is a professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania, and we are very honored to have him talk today about the Malaysia Agreement 1963. Now, those of you who follow my content or watch my work know that I am very fascinated by Malaysia. By the way, I have a brand new book out about Lee Kuan Yew, which is connected in turn to Malaysia Day, which was also his birthday. I think it's been 62 years ever since that agreement came into force. Has it not been, Prof?
The agreement was signed in the middle of 63, and a few months later, Malaysia was bombed.
Wow, okay. Today we're going to be talking about some of the developments that have been happening recently. There's been a lot of agitation or movement really from Sabah and Sarawak in the direction of restoring historical grievances, in moving things like, for example, parliamentary seat allocations, which is a very interesting and also complex topic that relates to the foundation of Malaysia. You've also got the question of oil and gas resources. Those of you who have been following the Petros and Petronas saga would understand that. And there's this push to have more powers go over to Sabah and Sarawak to respect their historical role as foundational partners of Malaysia, not as states, but instead as partners in an equal parity right now. So, Prof, what are your thoughts on the whole 35% seat allocation thing?
Thank you very much, Victor, for the opportunity to speak to your audience about this issue. I'm a bit passionate about this issue for many reasons, but the main reason is not because I'm from Kuching. The main reason is I think it's really, really important that Malaysians in general understand where the Federation of Malaysia comes from, and that Malaysians understand their own history. As you're well aware, right, many of the things you spoke about in your podcast deals with contemporary history, and it sort of goes against the so-called official narratives. The official narrative is basically how the Malaysian state wants ordinary Malaysians to understand their own history. I'm sort of the weird one out reminding Malaysians, especially people from the peninsula side, that maybe the official narrative doesn't give you the complete picture of where Malaysia came from. I think the big controversy since last year has been about this 35% request by the governments of Sabah and Sarawak. So this 35% is about making sure that Parliament gives 35% of its seats. And here we have to be very specific. When we talk about Parliament giving 35% of the seats, right? It's 35% of the seats in the Dewan Rakyat, the lower house of the parliament, not the upper house, because there are some NGOs out there who are pushing very hard for Sabah and Sarawak to skip the lower house and get the 35% in the upper house. I'll just make very quickly 4 points about why I think this so-called 35% is really important. Because the main argument from the other side, right, the side that says that we shouldn't give 35% is that because they said this distort the Dewan Rakyat, right, 35% to these two regions, and they always make the argument that this goes against democracy, one man, one vote, and based on population figures. So obviously, if you look at it from today's standard, it's not going to work. The 35% is not going to fly. But I want to give 4 main reasons why I think it's really, really important. And these 4 reasons have to be taken seriously about why they deserve the 35%. You have to remember at the time the Federation was formed, right, it was very clear that the people negotiating the formation of this new Federation of Malaysia, right, wanted to make sure that out of the 4 territories of Malaya, North Borneo, Sarawak, and Singapore, that Malaya was obviously the big man on campus, so to speak, right? It had the resources, it was the most developed, it had a population, everything. So they wanted to make sure that, Malaya does not dominate the new federation. So that's the reason why in the time when Malaysia was established in 63, Singapore, Sabah, and Sarawak, the 3S, had 34% of the seats in the new Malaysian parliament. The reason why they arrived at this figure is very simple, because under the British Constitution, which Malaysia adopted, right, it says that if you want to alter the Constitution, you need two-thirds majority. So the idea is that Malaya cannot alter the Constitution of Malaysia without getting support for one of these three S, which collectively holds 34%. So when the people of Sabah and Sarawak ask for this 34% now, it's really about correcting, the original portion that was established at the start of the federation. Because what happened was that when Singapore left Malaysia in 65, Singapore had 15 seats, and those seats just disappeared. It wasn't redistributed to Sabah and Sarawak, and therefore they lost the 34%. So this is not about a distortion. It's about, looking back to try to correct a mistake that would happen in 65. So that's the first point. The second point is that Malaysia's federation, right, unlike Australia or the US, right, was built, as you mentioned, as a promise of a partnership between Malaya with Singapore, Sabah and Sarawak. So it was very clear, even from the early days when they were negotiating, right, Sabah and Sarawak were to be regarded as founder, regions for this thing called Malaysia. And that, if you were to set up a federation, right, you had 4 separate blocks. The 11 states in the Malay Peninsula, Sabah on their own, Sarawak on their own, Singapore on their own. So it's all about, having 3, after Singapore left, 3 founder states. So, federalism in the Malaysian context requires symmetry, right? You can argue that, Canada did the same thing because, for example, in Canada, the smallest state is a place called Prince Edward Island, right? They get, have equal share of the Canadian Parliament, even though they're so small. So, you compare them with Ontario, 14 million people. So it's obvious that they have a big voice as well. So far from causing instability, I think the 35% seats given to Sabah Sarawak is really about, simply to extend the fairness and to correct a historical mistake. Democracy in this part of the world, right, is not about voter ratio, but it's about honoring Constitution compact. So even though East Malaysia collectively has less than 80% of the vote share, right, you can turn it around and say, yes, we may have much smaller population, but, Sabah and Sarawak has 60% of Malaysia landmass. So if you want to play around statistics, right, there's all sorts of statistics you can pick up and say that, Sabah and Sarawak contribute 70% of the oil and gas resources of Malaysia. So is it fair that, they get a paltry 5%? So all these issues can lead to all sorts of disturbance. So that's the reason why the Sabah and Sarawak state government said, we do not want to disturb any of this. All we're asking for is a correction of the historical mistake that was made in 65 and bring back the original ratio that was built into the system at the start of the Federation in 63. So those are the points that I just wanted to make.
So I was reading about what the NGOs, specifically Engage, were talking about, right? And they were talking about this idea of how there will be electoral distortions if, you were to get back the 35%, which is something that you talked about before, right? But at the same time, right, it seems that there were seats that were actually added on to the Peninsular Malaysia constituencies repeatedly over the course of time, which caused like this dilution and everything like that. But the NGOs are basically saying that if you give Sabah and Sarawak what they deserve, apparently it will create a government that's unpopular. It's not supported by the will of the majority. So how do you respond to that? And how would you engage with their concerns?
So basically, my argument is that you cannot apply today's standards and lens to something that happened 60 years ago. So this is about correcting a historical mistake. You have to remember, right, when Sabah and Sarawak lost the 34% after Singapore exited from Malaysia, right? That was the start of the marginalization process. So if you remember what I said to you, right, it was very clear at the time Malaysia was formed. Malaysia had 4 founding entities, political entities. Singapore, North Borneo became Sabah and Sarawak. So when Singapore left, the 15 seats disappeared. Many people think that the 15 seats were redistributed to Malaya. That did not happen. Malaya gained additional seats because of redelineation exercise later, not because the Singapore seats went to them. So that is not the argument I'm making. The argument I'm making is about correcting a historical mistakes. Now, the thing you mentioned about, Sabah and Sarawak becoming too powerful, I think in some ways that is a very stupid argument, right? It's a stupid argument because in the Malaysian context, if you look at the government's form, all the key governments formed since independence, it's always been a coalition government, right? So a coalition government means that you try to bring as many people as possible onto the table. So even if Sabah and Sarawak collectively get 35%, right? This is about building a strong coalition in East Malaysia, which means that the East Malaysians, either Sabah or Sarawak or collectively, will never sit outside the main table. You see my point? The thing is that when they lost the 34%, right, for a very long time, they were no longer sitting on the main table, despite the fact that they were founding, they were the founding parts of the federation, right? So when they lost it, if you remember, during Mahathir's time, the standard joke about Sabah and Sarawak was that they were the fixed deposit. It doesn't matter what we do here on the Malaya side, right? We can always rely on Sabah and Sarawak to provide the dividends. So this is what I meant when I said correct historical mistakes. I don't think the people of Malaya, if they understand how deep the people of Sabah and Sarawak feel about this issue, right, can deny them the 35%. So as I mentioned, right, all governments in Malaysia since the founding has always been a coalition. Simply provide Sabah and Sarawak with an additional from 25% now to 35%, additional 10 points, right? Doesn't mean they're going to dominate the process. It is the reverse that will happen. It will force true unity because it means that whoever forms a coalition on the Malayan side, right? Because Sabah and Sarawak holds 35%, right? You got to take their interests seriously. So in some ways, it is actually much better for Sabah and Sarawak, to hold a bigger share. But again, that is not what I base my argument on. My argument is that this is about correcting a historical mistake.
Thank you for that. But human selfishness, though, can be quite striking, I would say. And when you think about the nature of the agreement, for example, that was signed, so there have been a lot of these discussions recently about what's actually in the MA63, and even if we look through the MA63 right at the moment, right? So there is no actual indication, right, of whether the seats that Singapore lost, right, would actually go back all the way to Sabah and Sarawak. There's no mention really of redelineation. And that's the argument that's basically been made by Harun, our former speaker, if I'm not wrong. Now, I guess the question is, though, it's not something that's written out on paper, right? So then, how do you think that Sabah and Sarawak can really start pursuing that, even in the absence of a written indication that oh, you are not just resource colonies, you are not just there to be exploited? How should they do that?
So I think the first thing I would say is that Harun's obsession with the actual silence of the text is not a surprise. This is how lawyers look at things. Everything has to be written down. And you can also make a very powerful argument that, he says that this is a political narrative, but his opinion that this 35% is not valid is also a political opinion, ironically, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that, obviously when they did this thing, 34% for Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore, right, there was a clear intent. If you look at all the background papers written by the officials involved in the negotiations, in fact, the official British history make it very clear that, Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore would not have gone along with this formation of this new federation called Malaysia if they were not given the indirect veto power of 34%. So it is true that it is not there in black and white, but it is also true that if you read through the documents leading towards the signing of the MA63, right, it's made very clear that Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore would not have come on board without this veto power. can I make an important point, right? That, this allocating 35% is not only correcting, as I keep mentioning, historical injustice, but it is also not a legal overreach. Because if you look around the world, right, the UK Scotland Act of 1998 granted regional powers, and there was no explicit clause in the UK constitution, right, that talks about this. But because of historical grievances, they granted the Scotland Act to make sure that the Scottish people were happy. So this is not something new at the rest of the world, right? And also the other point I want to make, which I think is really missing from the current debate, is that just because the thing is not written down in the constitution, right, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Okay. And I can give you a very, very simple example, right? So for years, especially after the 1969 racial riots, all the UMNO politicians, the Malay establishment, even today, they talk about this idea of social contract of Ketuhanan Melayu. Now, if you were to comb through the Malaysian constitution, I can guarantee you the word social contract does not exist and the word Ketuhanan Melayu does not exist. Now, you tell me, is this a real thing or is it not a real thing? Okay, just because it's not written down, don't tell me it doesn't permeate through the constitution. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make is that yes, it may not be written down as part of the constitution. The point is that they don't have to write it down because nobody expected Lee Kuan Yew to have a huge falling out with the Malay establishment, and he negotiated exit 1 year after joining Malaysia. Nobody expected that. And if you read Tunku's on memoirs, right, he said it very clearly. He found that he had no other choice but to let Singapore go. And we know that he really, agonized over this decision because he did not even consult the people of Sabah and Sarawak, or at least the political leaders. Because you have thought, right, if there were 4 founding members, if one of them want to jump ship, don't you think that you should at least inform the other 2 founder members that, Singapore intends to leave the Federation? And yet the whole thing was kept very secret. They called a special sitting of Parliament, passed the Singapore Act, and Singapore was out. Okay? So the point I'm trying to make is that, yes, Art Harun is absolutely right in a sense that it is not written down anywhere. My answer to that is that just because it's not written in the Constitution doesn't mean that it's not real, as I gave the example. And secondly, right, nobody actually expected Singapore to leave immediately so soon, right? 2 years after the Federation was established. I mean, some people joke that the ink was not even dry when Lee Kuan Yew left. The only thing that was not dry was that Lee Kuan Yew cried on Singapore TV about leaving the Federation.
Yeah, and that was really such a powerful moment. And what maybe not everyone knows is that Donald Stephens, now Tun Fuad Stephens, actually wrote a letter, and I'm not sure if you've seen this. Like, here's the end of the letter. His daughter Farida Stephens actually read it for a CNA documentary, but basically the ending words of the letter were, "The idol is made of cheap clay after all," referring to Lee Kuan Yew. But also to the other point that you raised, I think that that's very interesting because it's like, if you don't accept that Sabah and Sarawak have this partnership status, or that they should have that partnership status, then you therefore cannot accept, for example, that the social contract exists as well, because it's the same sort of like logical justification or basis. But I want to move on to another thing that these NGOs have been saying recently. So then they say, for example, why are you so obsessed with the Dewan Rakyat? Can't you see our difficulties? We're trying to represent our constituents right here. So then, this Project Sama and some other NGOs, they propose that, oh, well, why don't you just go ahead and add in some senator seats, like make the Dewan Negara go up 15 senators each for Sabah Sarawak, and you then have maybe 100 seats in total. I think it's called the Dewan Negara 3500 model. Is that idea that maybe it's more feasible and it helps somehow to strengthen the Senate and also address the historical marginalization? So how do you respond to that?
So I'll start off by saying again what I've been saying all along. One thing is that I need to correct you. I never talk about partnership. I always talk about Sabah
Ah,
and Sarawak as founder entities of founding states.
okay.
Founders of the federation, not so
Founder
much.
entities.
Huh?
Got it.
The partnership, of course, can argue about partnership, but basically you can't run away from the historical fact. Even the Malay nationalists, it's quite clear that Sarawak, Sabah, and Singapore were the founder states of federation. I don't think
Mm.
anybody can dispute that. Okay, now on this idea of 35 stroke 100, which is 35% of the Dewan Negara, I only have a few comments to make. One, this is not part of the original agreement. The original agreement was 34%, 35% in the lower house, the Dewan Rakyat. Okay, so that's the first thing. But let me say something about the Dewan Negara. I personally feel that this is sort of a dirty trick played by the NGOs to try to get Sabah and Sarawak to skip the real power, which is real in the Dewan Rakyat, not in the Dewan Negara. The reason why I say Dewan Negara is not it's not where the power lies, is because it is widely seen as not legitimate. You can speak to the political class in Malaya, not in Sabah Sarawak. They always say that Dewan Negara is more of a toothless paper, a tiger. Even the same NGOs who support this Dewan Negara 3500, right? Previously, they also criticized the Dewan Negara as a place where it is seen as a political appointment or reward. If you lose an election, you're coming as a senator, or if the government wants to appoint you a minister, right? They used to call it a backdoor ministers, right? You get
Mm.
appointed as a Dewan Negara senator before you appoint a minister. So
Ah.
even officials themselves, right, do not take it seriously because we know all the action is in the lower house. Okay, so that is where the real power lies. The other thing, final point to make about the so-called Dewan Negara, right? Under Article 45 of the Malaysian Constitution, right? People don't realize that, out of the 70 members, more than half, 40 are appointed by the Yang di-Pertuan Agong. In other words, they do not represent the states, right? More than half actually do not represent the states. So they sort of represent sectorial interests or whoever the prime minister at Agong will nominate, okay? So only 26 are elected by the state legislature.
Mm.
So you can see, right, when this NGO said that, oh, these senators can represent the state, this is just pure nonsense because you look at the makeup now, the majority of senators don't represent states. 40 are appointed directly by the Yang di-Pertuan Agong, and they represent, interests the government feels are not represented, that they want rakyat. So
Mm.
it is not true that that you can replace the Dewan Rakyat with Dewan Negara. To me, it's very much what they call a trick used by the NGOs to make sure that Sabah and Sarawak do not gain real power and that the historical wrong is not corrected. So that's the reason why I'm very angry. And some people say that I'm overdoing it because I call this also very much a colonial mentality. A colonial mentality is where the colony masters, tell the colonial people, right, you guys can't think for yourself. We will give you a better deal because we think better than you are. So if
Mm.
you look at all the political leaders from both the government and the opposition in Sabah and Sarawak, right? I'm not saying all, but the overwhelming majority, at least the governing coalition of both Sabah and Sarawak, right? They've asked for this 35%. So you can't tell me that this doesn't represent the voice of the political class in East Malaysia. And who are these NGOs? They're not elected. How dare they go and tell the elected class in Sabah and Sarawak that, you guys don't know anything. We know better, and therefore we suggest you get, the 35 senators in the Dewan Negara. So as I said earlier, Dewan Negara is not where the action is. Even the current ministers laugh, at the Dewan Negara people. And secondly, right, this is a fact. You look at Article 45 of the Constitution, majority of senators are not appointed to represent the states. So you have to be very careful when these NGOs make specific recommendations. A lot of them do not have very good intent towards Sabah and Sarawak. They like the idea of Sabah and Sarawak being dominated by Malaya. Now you can't blame them, right? Because they've dominated Malaya. They've been dominated by Malaya for so long. This is the way things are always been done, and I don't blame them for actually trying to keep the domination of Sabah and Sarawak.
Yeah. And like even when you say NGOs, right? Like there can be all sorts of like sketch affiliations. You don't even know like how they're even related to like a party or not related to a party or anything like that. So lots of open questions. But let's now move on to a very important point on ownership. Now, I remember that in our last conversation, right? So you were talking about the Petronas Twin Towers, and you said, if I'm not wrong, the left tower was built with gas and oil from Sabah and the right tower from Sarawak. I still remember that comment. But now I want to talk a little bit about this idea, right, of our biggest cash cow in this entire country, which is Petronas. Now, a lot of people are saying right now that if you fix these historical grievances, then you're going to destroy Petronas. You will kill the cash cow. And I remember actually a commenter, right, on Facebook was saying that, well, if you didn't have Petronas, it's not like Sabah and Sarawak could have extracted the oil and gas anyway. So then Petronas did a favor to Sabah and Sarawak. And a famous politician, I think, mentioned that the PDA 1974, which is the Petroleum Development Act, so that gives Petronas complete control, but it's also fair and it was rational at that time. If you let Sabah and Sarawak get what they want, then what's going to happen is that Petronas is going to have a revenue drop, and we already saw that it had been experiencing revenue drops and staff slashings, freezes on hiring, so on and so forth. And what happened at the end of the day is that you end up losing billions from national development. We can talk about that later. Why do you think that Sabah and Sarawak are going so hard at this point of trying to get control over the oil and gas resources at this point? And how would you respond to the people who say, stop being so selfish, this is all for the country?
I'll start with the last point first. This thing about Petronas going to go bankrupt or something big will happen to Petronas if Sabah and Sarawak get ownership of oil and gas, right? This is just fear mongering. Petronas is not going to collapse even if Sabah and Sarawak get back the ownership. It's all about a media campaign to put pressure on Sabah and Sarawak and to make them look back. Now, if you read carefully about what the people want from Sabah and Sarawak want, right? They're not talking about taking back. They're talking about getting back a bigger share of the resources. So they're still willing to share, but they just said that we want to take a bigger share. They're not asking for share in Petronas or to disturb the 5% royalty. A lot of the time, if you look at what Petros is doing, right, they say that, all the Petronas downstreaming process, right, we want a bigger share of that so that Sarawak companies can get involved. Same thing with Sabah. The Sabah oil company is actually based on Petros, if you look at their articles of incorporation, right? Mm-hmm. So I'll answer you very simply about all these concerns that West Malaysian has. You have to remember, right, since PDA, right, it has been estimated, and I think the estimate is quite correct, that 500 billion has been taken out from Sabah and Sarawak, okay? This is 500 billion, not even the 5% going back to Sabah and Sarawak. This pure 500 billion at a minimum has been taken out. And yet Sabah has consistently remained one of the poorest states. If you look at some of the poorest districts in the whole of Malaysia, right, on the top 20 list, right, it is overpopulated by areas in Sabah and Sarawak. I can tell you in Sabah today, right, you heard about the flood problem, all that sort of thing, right? You will hear constant complaint that they don't even have regular water supply or regular electric supply. How is that possible when they are a major, oil producer in Malaysia, right? This is after 60 years of the Federation. Surely, if you know that Sabah and Sarawak are having developmental problems, right? Petronas can take so much money out. Why didn't they pour a bit more back? So if you look at the way Petronas has built, spend their own money on projects, right? In addition to the support to the Malaysian budget, right? If I were to ask a person in the street, what are the two major projects that's always been associated with Petronas? Of course, you mentioned one already, Petronas Twin Tower. The other one that is constantly associated with Petronas, and Petronas pay for that, is Putrajaya. Right? Putrajaya was funded mainly, the corporation was basically run and funded by Petronas. Now, let me ask you and turn around the table and ask you a very simple question. Can you name me an iconic building or project in Sabah and Sarawak that was built by Petronas? And, you'll be scratching your head. I don't think you can answer it.
Nope.
You see, the point is not about, taking back oil and gas resources. It's taking back a bigger share so that Sabah and Sarawak can catch up the development. And it's also about historical justice, not economic sabotage. So when people play this game about blaming Sabah and Sarawak or trying to tear down Petronas, right? Petronas shedding stuff, all these things. A lot of this has got nothing to do with Sabah and Sarawak, but it's got to do with the international market in oil and gas. So it's got nothing to do with Sabah and Sarawak. And if you look at international big oil companies, are much, much bigger, like the Seven Sisters, the really, really big one, right? Shedding stuff is very common in the oil and gas industries because they hire people based on project. So, for example, if I find new oil fields off the coast of Bintulu or Sarawak, right, immediately I'll be hiring people. If I don't find a new oil field, right, I'm going to let people go. So it is quite common. So all this talk about Sabah and Sarawak wanting to destroy Petronas, like I said, it's just fear mongering. It is not real facts. If you speak to people in the oil industry, right, they are saying that they are still signing joint ventures with Petronas. All Sabah and Sarawak are asking for is that we want a big more of the action on oil and gas in the respective states. That is all.
Thank you for that. So this idea of asking for a bigger share, right, is a pretty common theme, like in what you've been mentioning so far. And of course, it connects to this idea of historical injustice. But I want to get your thoughts on this idea of where Malaysia is going to go politically. There's a fear that somehow or another, if you start giving these seats over to Sabah and Sarawak, then what's going to happen is that potentially they can control the entirety of what the peninsula ends up doing. They could end up becoming dominant, so to speak. And even now, we can see that in the 2022 elections, Sarawak and Sabah were kingmakers. Who they align with could have very much changed the entire future of Malaysia at that time. When you think about this idea of a shift in power, which is what will definitely happen if what you hope for comes to pass, why do you feel that that is necessary at this time? And how do you deal with all those people who are trying to hold on to the past, even knowing that what they're doing is putting on chains that they do not deserve to put on the true founding partners of this entire country?
So my answer is that this is about dealing with historical grievances. I think what you're alerting to is that many people on the Malay establishment in Malaya are very worried about two things. One is that, if you give more rights to Sabah and Sarawak, you are fueling the secessionist movement that eventually they'll break away. Secondly, is that they're worried that, the more rights we give to Sabah and Sarawak, Johor, Kelantan, Terengganu will also knock on our door and say that we want the same deal. All these are actually false. The second one, I'll deal with it first, right? So Kelantan, Terengganu, and Johor cannot ask for the same deal. It's because they were part of the Malayan Federation setup. So they don't have status as founder states of the new federation, okay? So they don't have the right to ask for it. Now, the first question on whether giving Sabah and Sarawak more autonomy will lead to trouble in the future, right? My answer to these people is very simple. More decentralization and more autonomy to Sabah and Sarawak actually prevents succession because it was centralized control, right? Especially during the Mahathir autonomy that made the people of Sabah and Sarawak very angry. Centralization by taking powers away from Kuching and Kota Kinabalu, even though in MA63 they were promised, high level of political autonomy. So it's actually the fault of Putrajaya itself that created the situation. So they're asking them to reverse it back to the original thing. So autonomy actually prevents succession, okay? So you can see this very clear. We had this problem in Europe, the famous Catalonia issue, right? And it was only in 2017 that Spain passed the special autonomy law, and that immediately cooled the temperature down. That took away the wings for the secessionist movement, right? Because they want to honor regional identity. And Sabah and Sarawak, we went into this Malaysia agreement with a very clear understanding the uniqueness of Sabah and Sarawak will be retained, not centralized in Kuala Lumpur, okay? The other thing I will tell these people is that decentralization or providing autonomy to parts of the federation is actually the globally federal models. For example, you look at Canada and Australia, where the states are a very successful federal system, where the individual states and provinces have a high level of autonomy. In fact, centralization is the one that creates problem, not decentralization. And I will tell people, in the case of Sabah and Sarawak, right, decentralization actually strengthens Malaysia's multi-ethnic identity, not weaken it. I think there's a lot of people on the Malayan side also worried about the fact that Malaysia is slowly losing its multi-ethnic identity. So decentralization and providing autonomy to Sabah and Sarawak is actually a good thing. It is not a bad thing. And like I said, it will stop secession and it will also lower the level of distrust. Okay, so it is actually working towards more unity rather than less unity.
I have one last question to ask you, and it's kind of like a hot take question, as it were. But, Prof, do you think that Malaysia is going to succeed, or do you think that it's going to fail, given what you see of what's been happening lately?
So I think it's really, really difficult to predict which road Malaysia will take. Malaysia, of course, can take the road of being a more authoritarian, more Islamic, or they can turn left and become a more open society, going back to the original foundations of Malaysia in 1963. The reason why it's very difficult to predict is because the Malay electorate, right? The Malays are the one who decide the future of this country because they are the majority. The Malay electorate themselves are divided into different groups. But what I can say is that the biggest group in the Malay political landscape is currently past the drive for Islamic State. I think that is very, very strong. The second point I want to make is that Malaysia, since the fall of the long-standing Barisan National Government in 2018, right? We are within the world contemporary history. We are part of that transition process. Now, transition process doesn't mean you end up with a fully democratic state. You can also end up with an authoritarian state. But what we do know is that during the transition, and here I'm basing it on the examples for the former Eastern European countries after the fall of the Soviet Union. So the transition process usually takes 15 to 20 years. So it's a long process. It's not a short process. So basically what I'm saying is that it takes 4 or 5 elections before we have a very clear direction about which way Malaysia will be traveling. But what is certain is this. What I'm very sure is this. If the federal government in Putrajaya doesn't deal with the historical grievances of Sabah and Sarawak, then you're lighting a very, very dangerous fire on your eastern side. And that could lead to all sorts of unintended consequences. So for the federal government in Putrajaya, my advice is that deal with the historical grievances. All these people are asking is that you reset the federal-state relationship to what it was back in 1963. Nothing more, nothing less. And I think that's a very reasonable way of handling it, rather than arguing about whether you should apply today's political standards to something that happened in 63. Because if you start doing that, right, a lot of people will start questioning about all sorts of things that goes all the way back to the formation of the Malay Federation. And it will never end.
Does the social contract exist?
This is the bottom line. The people of Sabah and Sarawak are not asking for something that is outrageous. Malayans need to understand what the people of Sabah and Sarawak are asking for is a restoration of what the original conditions were like. Not nothing new, not more, not less. Just reset Malaysia back to what it was in 1963. That's all they're asking for. So Malayans should not be afraid of this. This is actually a good thing. Dealing with historical grievances is always a good thing because he can look around the world. There are many countries that could not deal with the historical grievances, and it led to a breakup. The one that is closest to our country is actually Indonesia. Okay? People don't realize, right? Historical grievances is one of the major reasons why we have a newly independent country called East Timor. Right? And this is a very new country. People keep forgetting it, right? And a bit further away, historical grievances also led up to the breakup of East and West Pakistan. Okay, so dealing with historical grievances is a good thing. This is a good, what I call a teaching moment for people in Malaya to understand what is happening in Sabah and Sarawak, and also, as I mentioned at the start of this podcast, to understand their own history. If you don't understand your own history, obviously you're going to take the wrong road. And that is the bottom line. We all should try to learn what is the real history about the formation of Malaysia and understand that the people of Sabah and Sarawak are simply asking what is due to them. That is all.
All right. Well, thank you, James.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.